Well, good afternoon, Laura. How are you today?
I'm great, Richard. Nice to be here with you.
Nice to be here with you as well. It looks very beautiful where you are right now. It's gorgeous.
Sunny California.
I love it. I love it. Well, we're here in Boston where it snowed this morning, so we've got that going for us. But I am so pleased to be joined by Laura Yecies, the CEO of Osteoboost Health. And thank you for taking the time to come join us here this morning. I am really excited to jump into it with you. Your folks reached out to us, started talking about Osteoboost, started talking about you. I was like, I'm in. I want to hear all about this. And I want to start at the beginning, Laura. So maybe you could just tell us a little bit about yourself, and then I'd love to dive into this critical issue in women's health that you're tackling.
Yeah, well, thank you. So I have been working here in Silicon Valley for um, almost 40 years, like over 35 years. And I spent many years in the tech world. So I
Mm.
worked in software, enterprise software, consumer internet. I ran the browser division at Netscape. I ran Yahoo Mail. And then I was CEO of a couple of startups. My second startup, Catch, I sold to Apple, and
Wow.
that team became the leadership of the Apple Watch team.
Hmm.
And so I've always sort of loved the wearable space. And after that acquisition, I saw this convergence between tech and healthcare.
Hmm.
And I think maybe because I grew up in a family of doctors and always had some of that interest, it just seemed like a great way to leverage the power of technology to reach many, many people,
Hmm.
but also the ability to improve people's health. And my first company in the healthcare space was in the concussion field. We had a concussion diagnostic. And then after I left that company, I was recruited by the founders of Osteoboost Health. And as soon as I connected with the company, I was like, oh my God, if this device works, this would be huge. We can really improve health for so many people. I was very familiar with osteoporosis. My
Hmm.
grandmother had bad osteoporosis.
Sure.
When I was in college, I worked several summers in a nursing home where my dad was medical director and saw what happens to people who break their hip, and many of them lose independence
Hmm.
in a nursing home. And I was also familiar with the fact that, we don't have a lot of great options for osteoboost. The medications are typically not used in osteopenia, and even in osteoporosis are not well adopted.
Hmm.
So, so I was all in, and I've been with the company now 4.5 years. We were founded by a physician, a physical medicine and pain doctor who
Okay.
focuses on spine, and he was seeing women with vertebral compression fractures, were the most common osteoporotic fracture, and was really determined to try to find a way to prevent those. And he saw all this evidence on, NASA research on whole body vibration, which was promising, but those devices were never able to get an FDA approval,
Right.
the class 2 device, and had the idea of putting that vibration in a belt form factor.
Hmm.
And that was really, I think, the key innovation. The company, it took a few attempts, but we've got some important NIH grants from the National Institute of Aging that funded us to start the clinical trial
Hmm.
at University of Nebraska Medical Center. And after we started the trial, it became clear that we needed more funding than just the grants. And so I was recruited in to be the CEO, raise capital, build a team. And fast forward, the trial completed. The results were outstanding in terms of the bone density. We then applied to the FDA for approval. We got that approval, and now we're getting ready to commercialize this.
Wow, that's outstanding. I love to, Laura, you and I have such similarities in the stuff that we've worked on throughout our career. So I've spent the last 26 years in the digital health product management space. I've not worked on wearables,
Oh,
but mostly developing products for doctors, nurses, clinical and quality type products, care management products, analytics types products. So I love that. And recently, I'm working with the National Institute of Aging and an ARPA-H grant to train a cohort of fellows in this space. So I love that you and I have so many synergies and so many wonderful connections.
Did you get one of the recent ARPA-H Women's Health?
Yes. Yeah, we got it a year ago. Yeah, which funded like 4 cohorts. So we're very excited about that. You had mentioned for a second about the NASA research, and you kind of went by it quickly. So I do want to come back to that because, gosh, isn't that interesting that this vibration therapy that you're using to sort of target bone health is rooted in NASA? Can you walk us through that just a little bit more, Laura? Because I'm fascinated by that.
It is really interesting, and NASA, has been responsible for so many innovations. There is history on research on vibration for bone health prior to NASA. So there was scientific research at a cellular level and with animals. But the first important studies on humans were funded by NASA. So, astronauts lose a tremendous amount of bone in space,
Sure,
a couple percent a month, and as opposed to per year. And so NASA was looking for ways to reverse or halt that bone density loss. And they funded research that was done by academics, but they funded the research. So that's really the history and the connection with NASA.
I appreciate what you also said a moment ago, Laura, about sort of the track record of scaling and working through tech startups. And you kind of finished your last point talking about how you're here now to really help with fundraising, with product commercialization. So often we have these amazing technologies, and I've been there as well, that have kind of, come up through NIH or come up through other sort of mechanisms. And really, we have to think very differently, right, about how we're going to commercialize this. And I'm curious about your previous experience there, being so tech company focused, having sort of a lot of leadership experience there. How are you kind of applying that as you scale this company, especially a company that's so mission driven, Laura?
Yeah, well, and it has been an interesting transition because, there is that sort of early scientific focus, and
Right.
the grants were critical. Research on osteoporosis, to do a big enough study over a long enough period of time is pretty expensive.
Mhm.
And we don't see a lot of startups in the bone health field for that reason.
Mhm.
So I suspect that the company wouldn't exist if we hadn't gotten that early funding
Mm.
from the government. But that's not enough. That's really for the early science. And so, when I needed to bring in resources to finish the trial, the full FDA, regulatory process, that was funded by the company. And as you pointed out, now we're in more of a commercial and scaling mode.
Right.
And frankly, to me, this is the most familiar
Mhm.
relative to my career, right?
Right.
For instance, when we were working through the FDA approval process, that was my first time
Hmm.
going through that process. Certainly, the full process like we did there.
Sure.
And so that was, kind of typical startup, on the job, on the journey. I of course
OJT.
say that, we worked with some experts and consultants who guided us, so we weren't completely on our own.
Right. Right.
What we're doing now in terms of, communicating with potential patients, developing, training and marketing material, a lot of that for me is more similar to what I've done in my career.
Mm.
When I've, done a lot of sales and marketing for technology products. And frankly, I'm really enjoying the fact that I'm trying to get the word out on something that I think can really help people,
Right.
something that's personally meaningful to me.
Sure.
I have osteopenia,
Mhm.
and I've been using Osteoboost the last few years, and it's stabilized my bone.
Wow.
And I hear from, essentially most of my friends who are my age also have osteopenia, right? My classmates. So when I post in my business school, or college class groups, I hear from a lot of the women that, this is a concern of theirs. So it's really gratifying
Mm.
to work on something that my peers and friends and family, um, care about.
And will benefit from as well. For sure.
Exactly.
For certain. For certain. Laura, you had mentioned that, this particular indication, this and osteoporosis and sort of osteoporotic fractures, so many women will suffer them, more so than heart attack, stroke. You had mentioned the expense associated with this. Is that the primary driver, Laura, as to why this has been overlooked for so long? Are there other sort of issues or things holding back the research here, or I don't even know if I would even just say research, Laura, but just the awareness and the attention? Is it the expense predominantly?
It's a good question, and it would be hard. I can't sort of prove what the answer, because it's like a counterfactual. Why has something not happened?
Yeah.
But there's certainly, or I think likely, a few factors. Scientifically, it's a hard problem.
Yeah.
Right? It's biochemically hard to positively influence your bone metabolism without having, deleterious side effects.
Right.
Research on bone, clinical trials on bone tend to be expensive because it takes at least a year to see results on imaging, and longer if you have to prove a fracture endpoint. So, but
It's complicated.
I think there's more to it than that. Issues that affect older women's health have unfortunately been overlooked. Right? I think there's just some acceptance that this is just part of aging, and a natural part of aging for women. And I don't agree with that thought process. In fact, I strongly disagree. Right? There's, heart attacks are part of aging, and we don't kind of accept that. We try to prevent them.
Right.
Cancer, is part of aging. We try to fight against that. And so, to me, frailty and fracture should be something that we try to prevent as aggressively or proactively as other health conditions. But for some reason, and I think there's some sociological and cultural factors here, that hasn't been the case. And unfortunately, some of the larger pharmaceutical companies, Lilly, Merck, Pfizer, who had programs in the fields, have exited. And when they've exited, their marketing dollars have exited.
Right.
Generic drugs remain, but people aren't marketing those drugs, and therefore they're not marketing the condition. Now, this is unfortunate. On the other hand, it's an opportunity. And I think an opportunity to take a new, more modern approach.
I know someone in my own family who tried to utilize some of the pharmaceutical agents and had the very common side effects, right, that were associated with those pharmaceutical agents, and has stopped her therapy as a result of that, right? So, it's a challenge for sure.
It is common now. We are not against pharmaceuticals for bone.
Sure. Yeah, I wasn't trying to imply that. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I know that, because when bone loss becomes really serious, they have a larger effect size, and it can be very important. But what to me is really interesting is being able to prevent the need for those drugs. Right. So, if you think about how we proactively test for and treat, potential cardiovascular disease, we're checking people's cholesterol like in their 30s and 40s, and we have numerous relatively safe drugs that people can start then. And you might be taking a statin in your 40s to prevent a potential heart attack in your 60s and 70s.
Right.
Prior to Osteoboost, we haven't had anything like that for bone health. The Fosamax, type drugs, they're, even if you use them in osteopenia, it's typically just for a few years, right? Because the side effects, the risk of those side effects increase with longer duration of use. The most powerful drugs, the anabolics, are typically used only 1 to 2 years. So we don't have this kind of long-term early intervention in the pharma space. And it's really remained for a device for, a startup and innovation to come up with an approach there. And, I think people really want to intervene early if
Yeah.
they can and if they're aware of the need. And frankly, I think it's going to work better.
Sure.
We saw that in our clinical trial. All the patients essentially benefited, but the patients who were younger had an even larger effect size. So we really want to get the message out to patients to get your DEXA scan, get tested. The test is safe and inexpensive.
Right.
So there's no reason to wait.
I was going to ask you about that, Laura, around clinical guidelines and standards for things like bone density, and have those started to change and evolve, and are there more recommendations for people to do those younger? I just don't know, so I wanted to ask you.
So it's an interesting topic. So the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force historically recommended DEXAs at 65. Now, if the average American woman has osteopenia at 58, that number is too late.
Pretty late.
And I think it's, less than 5% of women are taking hormone replacement therapy. They're going through menopause, they're going to lose bone at that time. And so, fortunately, the USPSTF guidelines have been updated that for women with risk factors, which estrogen loss is a risk factor, to consider testing earlier. We certainly think it's a good idea to have a baseline before menopause, right? Because in that way you can track, during that period of rapid bone loss, do you need to have an intervention?
Right.
And then potentially other health conditions warrant earlier screening. I wrote a post on LinkedIn today about celiac disease.
Yep.
There was an article in Nature recently that patients with celiac disease have worse bone density, probably during the time that they had celiac before they were diagnosed. Their nutrition was compromised, so they weren't getting calcium and vitamin D. There may be something else from the celiac also that's affecting.
Underlying.
But in any event, so the recommendation in this article was a DEXA at 45, right? And so I think, that is going the right direction. Knowledge is power. In terms of intervening early, it's better to prevent the loss of bone. It's hard to get it back.
I wanted to ask you about your storytelling too, because what you had mentioned, your LinkedIn post today in celiac disease and the consumer space, it's really crowded. Trust is everything in the consumer space. I don't need to tell you that. Your approach to storytelling, building trust with your target audience, I think was really interesting, especially again, you mentioned the post today. Talk to me a little bit about, again, if I'm not even aware of vibration therapy or aware of my bone density status, is it articles like this that kind of think about it from a bunch of different angles that help to kind of, get that story across, Laura?
Yes. And I mean, getting the message about our device and our science, it's not only the storytelling, it starts further back with the fact that we invested in doing a clinical trial, right? We could have done an over-the-counter vibration device. It might have worked.
Right.
We could have gotten something on the market a lot faster. But that wasn't what we wanted to do. We wanted to know for sure that the device worked, by how much, how to use it, that it was safe. And we also wanted to partner with physicians because bone density loss is a serious condition.
Sure.
And it should be managed by the patient's personal physician. They should have a baseline and to have it tracked over time. So, that trust, of course, right now we need to communicate clearly and conservatively and effectively about it. But it's not just the communication, it's sort of what we built and how we did that research. And now the nice thing is, because we invested in that research, the story is telling patients what those results are.
Right? Sure.
And sharing that data with their physician, and hopefully they'll get, a similar story from their doctor, and they'll get, we want to be kind of consistently sharing that information, and we're partnering with other, physicians and people, but also with an eye on making sure that we can stick with, a very clear, accurate description.
I appreciate what you're saying too about the clinical trial and getting Osteoboost FDA approved and really kind of trying to be at that intersection, right, of innovation and regulation. And I asked you about trust, and I'm sure it went a long way for credibility and growth, for sure, right?
Yeah, and I think it was needed in this field, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because people, I think they're apt to say vibration, that feels like kind of a consumer thing. How do I know it works? There have been devices marketed with claims for vibration that haven't been legitimate.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, there was a New York Times article just a week or two ago about companies marketing vibration platforms for weight loss. They don't really have any data, right? And so, unfortunately, that can be very confusing for patients. And so we have to go the other end of the spectrum and be very clear. This is what we studied. This is what our device is for whom. This is what we proved. And if you have this condition, here's, what you might be able to expect in terms of benefit.
That's wonderful. How was the payer integration piece, Laura? Was that a challenging sort of thing for you to work through?
Well, we're still working on it. So it is challenging. It's yet another, you have both kind of the government side, Medicare and Medicaid, as well as commercial.
Private pay, yeah.
So commercial. We're in the early days of that process.
That's great. That's great. I think of this concept of, you are working on it's not even a concept, it's a reality. I'm sorry. You're working on an application and a solution for osteoporosis. We mentioned how, it is affecting women disproportionately. You are a woman who is running this organization. We both know, and I don't need to tell you this, that in the venture community space, it's challenging as a woman to potentially overcome the burden of proof that's associated with investment. And you're also in a space that is predominantly women's health, although it does affect men and women, but predominantly women. Talk to me a little bit about, you've been in the tech space, right? And you've got the, your veteran status there. But I'm curious about, this is a podcast dedicated to women and women who are leading. Talk to me a little bit about, being in a male dominated space like health tech or medical devices and how you've sort of navigated through that, Laura.
I think I'm so used to being in a field that's male dominated. I don't think about it a whole lot.
Yeah, that makes sense.
When I started in tech, so first of all, when I went to business school, my class was like 20% women, 80% men. And I got into Silicon Valley, and those were the numbers. So that to me was just kind of, it's like breathing. That's like the air you have to breathe. And I didn't think a lot about it. Maybe there's some barriers there. Maybe there's opportunities. I think there's some of both. Actually, the first time I really started to think about it as a topic or an issue was when I became CEO for the first time. I went to, because at least there was the 20% or the 25%, right? And I had colleagues. And so I'm CEO of a company called SugarSync. We had a consumer software, like a sync and share solution. And one of my investors invited me to their CEO conference. So this venture capitalist firm, Sigma Partners, invited all the portfolio company CEOs. And I get there and I walk in, and there's maybe like 40 people in the room. And other than the person who checked me in, I was the only woman. The only one. So
an all too familiar story. Yeah.
And I was just shocked. I was like, oh my God, is this going to be a boring meeting? Do the women like know to stay home? Like, what happened? And it wasn't a boring meeting. It was a good meeting. But then at the lunch break, I go up to the partner who's on my board, and I was like, Greg, where are the women? What's going on here? I was just so shocked. He goes, look, Laura, you're the only one. Like, I was like, how could that be?
How can that be? Out of your entire portco that I'm the only woman leading it?
Well, but here's the other thing. He was like, well, actually, not only are you're the only one, you're the first.
Wow, geez.
This was in end of 2008 or early 2009.
Double.
I was like, oh my God, something is really broken here. But in the short term, I need to work on, the company was in a bit of a turnaround. It was really, really crazy. And it was also 2009 where the world, was.
We were still in a massive recession. Yeah.
We were in a massive recession. Yeah. So it was a difficult time. But a year or so later, as I could breathe a bit and the company was growing, I started actually blogging about women in tech and women leadership. And I started doing some coaching of other women because it was a real eye opener for me about this gap. And anyhow, fast forward, I actually find the healthcare field with medical devices being a bit of an exception.
Sure.
To be friendlier and there's more women. I think women have gravitated towards it because I don't know, we're sort of socialized to care about people. I also think, half the doctors graduating or more than half are women.
Are women, yes.
So women on the clinical side play a huge role in healthcare. I mean, my mother's an example. She was a physician. She still has her license, although I think she's more focused on being a great grandmother right now.
What kind of physician was she?
Family practice.
Oh, great.
Both my parents were doctors.
Lost art, family practice medicine.
Yeah, and she also ran a methadone clinic. I think that was starting in the late 70s or 80s.
Very progressive. Yeah.
Her time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
And still does family medicine. She does a lot of consults for family members.
I love it. I love it. My
coaches me on my knitting too.
That's great. The last organization I was at in the patient relationship space, patient engagement space was led by a female CEO. So I do agree with you there, Laura. Is there an approach that you have to sort of mentoring, coaching that you take today?
So I am not doing a lot of executive coaching right now just because the company
we are with the company
so much of my time, but I have really chosen to focus my coaching on either women or minorities because I think they can benefit from it. And but kind of back to your original question, and I will say that sort of medical devices is behind pharma and behind sort of digital therapeutics, digital health. And I think that's because of it sort of having its basis in mechanical and engineering, which has fewer women than, biology and chemistry and things like that. But I think the tide is turning right now where women's health, it's been underinvested in.
Agreed.
It's such an obviously huge market. And so the people who you have an opportunity, I think, for outsized returns because of that prior underinvestment. And I do think women are activated, particularly like fields related to menopause and older women. That demographic is looking for modern, innovative, safe, in many cases, non-drug solutions. They are at a stage in their life where they're focused on their health.
Yes.
In many cases, they're at a stage where they have more time and attention and disposable income to put towards healthcare. So I actually think the business opportunity in women's health is tremendous. And I think that we're going to see a shift in sort of the investor base. I'm hoping.
I hope so. I hope that follows. I really hope your prediction is accurate there, Laura. And as you were talking about this generation, I also think this generation is more tech savvy, right, as well. And I like what you said about they're less inclined to look for drug therapy. They're more inclined to look for other kinds of therapy, right? So I think you combine their desire to look outside of pharma also with they're a more tech savvy generation. And look, at the end of the day, they're the decision makers most of the time too, in terms of healthcare within their families, right? So,
well, but this, I think the tech savvy thing is interesting too, because an older generation that we might not have expected to be tech savvy, they lived through COVID. And they had to, if they hadn't adopted technology,
they had to.
They had to. And I think in many cases, they find it very useful and empowering, right? Because, what do we want to do when we're older? We one of the things is socialize and connect with friends and family. And technology is so powerful towards that. It's not a substitute for in-person.
Right. So, augmenting them.
So I think they are more open to technology. COVID also got people thinking about what treatments can you manage yourself in your home.
Right.
So I think that's another important trend.
I'd like to ask you somewhat of a philosophical question, Laura. And really it's around longevity. And, we used to hear this term a lot in the early days about, we're not living longer, we're dying longer. And, this tremendous focus on quality of life and were we really improving folks' quality? And I would love your sort of definition of longevity, Laura, and what that means to you. And certainly sounds like Osteoboost is working hard to redefine what longevity means and aging well means, especially for women. But I'd love to hear your definition of longevity.
I mean, I think there's a technical definition of longevity as living longer, but what we are focused on as a company is really on health span. I like that term. How many years are you living well and in the type of health where you can do the activities that you want to do? And I think bone health is like a very good example of, in the past, we might have had longevity, but not health span, right? So maybe, pharma or other interventions have allowed you to stay alive. But if you have multiple vertebral compression fractures and you're in pain and, you've lost mobility, your health span isn't great.
Right. And,
your musculoskeletal health plays such a critical role, I believe, in the quality of your life. So, if you want to be able to go for walks with friends, get in and out of your car, play with your grandchildren, go to activities, so much of that, and frankly, even, when we're talking later on in life, being independent, and that's, I think, of such critical importance to most of us. A lot of that comes down to, your musculoskeletal health and avoiding fractures, right? Oftentimes for older people, fractures are almost like a sentinel event in a negative way, right? And, of course, we've all heard about hip fractures. Hip fractures, between 20 and 30% of people don't survive a year.
Right.
And of those who survive, more than half lose their independence. So hip fracture is really a dreaded event for health span and lifespan.
Sure.
And we really want to prevent that. Right? We can fix the hip fracture, but we haven't. We've made almost no progress in the last 50 years on that all-cause mortality. And so we're really focused on preventing those fractures. Same thing with the vertebral fractures. It's a prevention game. And a lot of that is starting early. So, we're really trying to encourage people to invest in their health, in their bone health, in their 50s, 60s, using Osteoboost, but not just using Osteoboost, also doing the, exercise, nutrition, staying active, and then also working on, the exercise is not just for your bones, it's for your muscles and for your balance. Because how do you prevent fractures? Have strong bones, prevent falls, right?
Good balance.
That's all about, strong muscles and balance.
Yeah. I like how you're approaching it, like you said, with this combination therapy. It's not just one thing. It's this combination of so many things. And I like how you drew the notion of like it's bone health plus balance plus muscle that really makes it all the more opportunity for preventative medicine here. Right. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also because it's hard to move the needle in a big way for bones,
Mm.
right? So you
Hmm.
want to have all these things on board. And, if it's kind of logical, if you're stimulating your bones through exercise or through using Osteoboost, but you don't have the nutrition available, then your body's not going to respond to make the bone, right?
Right.
So you
Right.
need both.
Yeah, absolutely. Laura, I'd love to ask you before we kind of wrap up. You mentioned the work that you're doing now around payer approvals. What are some of the other exciting things or things that you are excited about as Osteoboost, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say osteopath, Osteoboost continues to evolve as an organization, as a company, a culture, a movement, a
Yeah.
product?
Well, it's one of the biggest things we're working on now is to get the word out, right?
Mm,
So we're seeing, for instance, from the physicians, a lot of the endocrinologists know about us because we presented at their conferences. We've been covered in some of the endocrine society magazines. And there's like, I think 9,000 endocrinologists in the US, but
wow.
there's, I don't know, two or 300,000 primary care doctors, internists, OBGYNs.
Hmm.
And so as a smaller company, we have to work hard to get the word out to them because
Sure.
they're going to see the patients with osteopenia early. And we
Mm,
want to get, it's interesting. The fact that there's a treatment for osteopenia and, the idea of doing an early DEXA, it's related,
mm,
right? Because what's the point of doing a DEXA early if you don't think that there's a treatment for osteopenia?
right. Right.
But if they know about the treatment, maybe we can encourage them to start doing that testing early. By the way, there's a lot of trends around AI, for instance, that I think are also going to lead to earlier diagnosis. So
Mm, sure.
analysis of other x-rays, so patients may start to get other indicators on their bone health. So I think
Mm,
that's sort of a good trend that will support. On the other hand, there's trends that are causing potential bone loss. So the GLP-1 medicines are very powerful and I think
right.
powerful towards public health, but there are concerns about loss of bone mineral density when people use them. So
Sure.
I think it's really an exciting time, and we
Mm,
want to contribute to that conversation, further the conversation to get more awareness. So I think that's our number one job right now as a
makes sense.
company to scale this and get it to more people. We also want to study osteoboost in other populations,
Hmm.
men,
Mm,
patients with osteoporosis. We just applied for a grant to study Osteoboost in women who just completed breast cancer treatment.
mm,
So we know cancer survivors oftentimes have bone loss, both
hmm.
women with breast cancer and men with prostate cancer treatment. So, you know, there's a lot that we want to do scientifically
Right.
to 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 kind of grow our impact.
I love it. I love it. I want to thank you for the work that you're doing in this movement towards more personalized, more preventative ways to tackle such important women's health issues and just general health issues as well. I appreciate that, Laura, and I want to thank you for that.
Oh, thank you for the opportunity. We really want to help people stay strong, independent, healthy, and be a partner for them on that journey.
Wonderful. We've been speaking with Laura Yecies, the CEO of Osteoboost Health. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for your time today, and we wish you the best of luck.
Thank you, Richard.